Today I am reacting to the appointing of Mojtaba Khomeini. So this is the guy here. We have him. This is a picture. And basically, he is getting a lot of flack from the Western media. As I said in my last video, talking about this war with Iran, this terrible, terrible war, there's going to be a lot of propaganda. The US and Israel are going to put out a shit ton of propaganda attempting to tell you that this is righteous and so on and so forth. And that is what I want to address here. So, one of the things about Mojtaba is the idea that he was the son of the last Ayatollah. Okay, and so the idea is that that's somehow a bad thing, being lambasted in the media, particularly the Western media. Well, I wanted to address that because this isn't an exclusively Iranian thing, nor is it an exclusively Islamic thing or Shia Islamic thing. So I have some examples here. So, of course, we have the Khomeini family themselves. There's him with his illegally murdered father. So they're sort of next to one another. Now, I have some examples. So we have the Bush family right here. As you can see, you've had two presidents from that family. You've got George H.W. Bush, or as I prefer to call him, George Bush the First, and George W. Bush, or as I prefer to call him, George Bush the Second. Why do I do that? Because it shows the dynastic nature of the family. That yes, like officially, it's not a dynasty and all of this sort of stuff, but functionally, which I think we need to start thinking more in terms of as sort of ordinary people, is that functionally it is dynastic in nature. And so that is why what I'm talking about with regards to George Bush the first and George Bush the second. And what's interesting is that Prescott Bush here was responsible for a failed coup d'etat against President Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Isn't that interesting? And so he has treason in his blood. The very man, the very father and son, pair, duo, if you will, one of them possibly being involved in CIA drug trafficking, the other one involved in lying to his people about weapons of mass destruction, come from a treasonous person. That is Prescott Bush here, the individual that I've highlighted. And so that is one prime example that we have in the so called West. The next example that I wanted to get into is the Trudeau family. So we have the Trudeau family. They've long been involved in Canadian politics. You have, for example, Justin Trudeau, himself the Prime Minister or former Prime Minister of Canada, and his father was actually the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And so, again, this is functionally dynastic in nature. Okay, again, I know officially it's not dynastic, but functionally it is. And then, of course, we have the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, American example, that being the Kennedy family. So we have here Patrick Joseph Kennedy, Joseph Patrick Kennedy the first, and of course John F. Fitzgerald Kennedy, the one that was tragically assassinated in front of his own wife even. And so we have here again another family who functionally act as a dynasty that have long sort of had an influence on American politics and to this day, in fact, continue to have an influence on US politics. For example, we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ran for president in the 2024 United States presidential election. originally as a Democrat, but changing his affiliation to independent in October 2023. The family members spoke out against him, mainly due to his anti-vaccine views. Of course, we need not get into that here, although I'm definitely no fan of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That is, again, Robert F. Kennedy II, if we're to be honest. Um, and so we have Caroline Kennedy, who's named uh, daughter of President Kennedy, who was named in 2022 by President Biden as U.S. ambassador to Australia. This is the lady here, Caroline Kennedy, Caroline Bouvier Kennedy. And so these are examples of sort of unofficial but functionally so dynasties. And so why Iran is suddenly the exception to this rule is obviously to do with the fact that there is a war being waged against them. And so this man, Mojtaba Khomeini, is the current Ayatollah. No, these are just functional examples. We haven't even gotten into the official examples. The British monarchy, the Norwegian monarchy, the Saudi monarchy. People are not talking about that. The imperial family of Japan. Worldwide dynastic succession is not exactly unusual. It's not some sort of perversion necessarily. Not ideal, personally, from my perspective as a Republican, a big R Republican. That is an uppercase Republican as opposed to a lowercase Republican, meaning the ideology of republicanism as opposed to the American Party, the Republican Party. And so, as a staunch capital R Republican, I am definitely no fan of succession, but unlike the propaganda that's being put out now, that's rather being vomited now, if you think about it, I am consistent in my application of republicanism because republicanism is a principle that requires checks and balances. And the fact that you have these wealthy families, the Bush family, the Trudeau family, and the Kennedy family, functionally acting as dynasties means that, in a sense, republicanism has failed. Really think about it. Now, granted, Canada is not a republic, although she ought to be. But my point nonetheless stands that we have worldwide, particularly in the West, the so-called West, I can get into that another time, that we have functional dynasties that exist across long stretches of time. And this is purely because of their wealth. And so the sole reason Mojtaba Khomeini is being singled out for having succeeded his father is because of the current imperial war. It really has nothing else other than that fact alone.